So welcome back, everybody. This week's Torah portion is a big one, or an intense one, or a famous one. It contains the Akedah, the story of the binding of Isaac, which has yielded so much speculation and liturgy and philosophy throughout the ages, because this test, Nisayon, is such a mind-boggling one in so many ways. So lots of people speculate about what the test itself was. The Torah, right, tells us that God tested, that word is there, tested Avraham by asking him to take his son. And presumably it would seem that the test was, would Avraham make the ultimate sacrifice for God? And this, of course, raises its own kind of problematic ethical questions about what kind of God would ask for such a sacrifice. And again, there's lots to say there. But in light of that, the Sfat Emet also joins the conversation in thinking about the nature of the test itself. Just one more word before we jump into text. I think that part of what motivates him, along with others, to want to kind of complicate or reread or make suggestions about the nature of the test is that it would seem that that framing the test as, will Abraham make the ultimate sacrifice, again, implicates God, or raises all kind of theological questions about God and cruelty, and that gets us into a whole difficult thicket. And so perhaps in an attempt to salvage God, one might say, there's all kind of commentary that offers a different perspective. And I'm not sure that we totally salvage God along the way, but we do get some interesting food for thought and interesting ways of potentially understanding the nature of this test as itself paradigmatic. What I mean by that is, as we've talked about with Lech Lecha before this, right? Avraham's journey is put forward and understood or received throughout our tradition as one that ought to be read through the lens of paradigm. That the journey he takes and the spiritual kind of character that he represents ought to be for us a model of how to live. And it's a pretty big ask to suggest or to ask of people beyond Abraham a test of this magnitude. And so there's an interest in kind of, maybe you might say, tempering the test somewhat so that it also might be applicable to others as well. So that's all, hopefully, by way of introduction. And I want to start with the words from the Torah text itself, source number 2 from Bereshit, or Genesis 22. Vayihi achar hadvarim ha'ela va'elokim nisat Avraham vayomer elav Avraham vayomer hineni. Right, so sometime afterwards, after the last stories of Lech Lecha, God put Abraham to the test. The divine said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am, hineni. Vayomer, kachna et bincha et yichidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak ve'lech lecha. That's the second Lech Lecha that we see, by the way, after last week's Lech Lecha. Here's the next chapter of Lech Lecha is Lech Lecha el Eretz HaMoriah ve'alehu sham le'olah alachad haharim asher omar elecha. God said, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. So, Vayashkem Avraham baboker vayachavosh et chamoro. So Avraham woke up in the morning and he readied his donkey, vayachavosh et chamoro, vayikach et shnei na'arav ito, and he took his 2 servants with him, ve'et Yitzchak beno, together with his son, vayivaka atzei olah, vayakam vayelech el hamakom asher amar lo ha'elokim. And so he split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place of which God had told him. And they journey. They go on their next journey, again, after Alach Lecha. And that journey takes 3 days. And then we are told the following: Vayom hashlishi vayisa Avraham et einav Vayar Atamakom merachok. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. The Sfat Emet, this who is our anchor for our journey together, is really interested in just these last words. Vayar Atamakom merachok. Avraham saw God from a distance or from afar. Sorry, I already gave you that away. Avraham saw the makom, the place, Avraham saw the place from afar, which right in the literal reading of the text suggests he beheld a landscape, right? He saw something in the distance. He saw a mountain. The Midrash says he saw a particular mountain being designated by a cloud on top of it. And he discerned from there that that's the location. That is where he ought to go. But of course, the Sfat Emet sees something else in here. And he says the following. We can scroll up to the first source, please. He says, "B'nisayon ha'akedah ktiv vayar merachok." That's what we just saw, right? With regard to the nisayon, to the trial of the akedah, of the binding, the pasuk says vayar merachok. Ki hakadosh baruch hu nisa oto b'midat hayirah. Okay, so here he makes really nice wordplay, and he notices that the word vayar, to see, is frankly indistinguishable from the word to fear, vayira. Right? The vocalization is different, but the letters are the same. And from that recognition, he makes a claim that the essence of the akedah itself was fear, or differently translated, yirah can mean a bunch of things: fear or awe, you might say, maybe reverence. You can think of other words that align with yirah. But yirah is always put in opposition to a different approach, and that is ahava, or love. And the Sfat Emet says, ki ikar midato haya ahava v'kirvut. He's making a claim here about the nature of the test. What is God trying to elicit from Avraham in this very dramatic way? And he suggests that this was a test or an ordeal pertaining to yirah, to, again, awe or fear. Because Avraham is a character who is identified throughout our tradition, from the Torah itself, or the Tanakh itself, really, meaning it's found after Abraham's gone. It's found as a reference in Nevi'im, in prophets, and then the theme of the identification between Avraham and Midat Ahava, Avraham and like the path of love, is just developed and developed and developed through the Kabbalistic sources and Hasidic sources. And in general, if one could say that, the three forefathers are each identified with a certain kind of dominant trait or a dominant way of accessing God. Like the frequency they lived on was different. They all had intimate relationships with God and vibrant spiritual lives. But as we know, there are plenty of different ways to walk that path. And Avraham is usually identified with love, or ahava. Yitzchak, his son, is usually identified with yirah, fear or awe. And not for this time, but Yaakov oftentimes he's the most, well, anyway, he's oftentimes the attribute of truth, or emet, is usually identified with him, which is interesting because he's not always known for being the truth teller. In any case, so we see here, right, that these, from the Sfat Emet's perspective, the purpose, if one could say, the purpose of the Akedah was to see, or to rather inculcate into Avraham, a kind of spiritual frequency, a kind of spiritual approach that would balance out his natural inclination toward love alone. The suggestion being that I don't want to use the word correct, but that a balanced pathway, a balanced spiritual pathway, has elements both of love and of awe or fear. I'll also throw in case this is useful, related terms that might resonate are chesed and gvura. Chesed, loving kindness; gvura, strength. Also can be translated in a bunch of ways. But these kinds of ways of being and these inner attributes and character traits need to both be deployed in the service of God and the service of spiritual life. And Avraham needed to learn that because he was out of balance. He was all love, all chesed. And hence the phrase, Vayar Mirachok, he suggests is that Avraham, right, experienced yirah. He experienced yirah. Vayar to him means vayirah, but he was afraid of a God who would not be his friend per se, but rather be his commander, maybe even, right, irrational, cruel commander. This is not the God that he was used to knowing, it seems. And now, very interestingly, he brings a proof text for the nature of Avraham's kind of baseline relationship with God. And he does that using the words, he says, Kimo shekatuv hamechaseh ani. Now that's a reference to a verse regarding the destruction of Sodom. Okay. In the context of God, or about who is about to destroy Sodom, God says, "Hamechaseh ani me'Avraham et asher ani oseh," or something just like that. Right? God says, "Can I really hide from Avraham all that I'm about to do?" Implication: no, I can't. I have to go tell him. And what follows is that famous episode of Avraham actually negotiating with God, trying to save the people of Sodom, bargaining for fewer and fewer righteous lives to be occasions for the salvation of the city. I do find it really intriguing that is the site for the Sfat Emet's understanding, let's say, of the Ahava in the relationship with Avraham, or the relationship between God and Avraham. And I'm going to leave that as maybe a hanging question that we can come back to. Think about it. Think about the fact that it seems like the Sfat Emet is trying to make a claim about Avraham's relationship to God, that Avraham acts out of love, acts out of a kind of ahava v'kirvut, in the language of karov, intimacy. That's what primarily animates Avraham. But the proof text for it is actually about seemingly God's relationship to him. Perhaps that God acts out of love. Or maybe this is a complicated sense of what love actually is. Is it disclosure? Is it not protecting somebody from one's own destructive impulses? That's a very odd idea, I think. But here you have these words, hamechaseh ani, coming as a placeholder for Avraham really a chesed guy, or Avraham really an ahava guy. And what he needs is the balance of yirah. He says, Ve'ata haya merachok b'bchinat hayirah, lachen nomar yarei Elokim ata. I'll stop there for a moment. So I want to, well, two things I want to point out about this. Number one is that the word yirah appears multiple times in the story of the Akedah, and it is that the Sfas Emes is trying to point out here. On the one hand, yes, Vayar Atamakom merachok has this shoresh or root, yud resh aleph, or yirah, yareh, and that binds it together. But he also notices that after the ordeal is done, what is said to Avraham is, now I know that you are a Yarei Elokim. Now I, God, know that you are a fearer of God, or one who experiences God through awe or wonder. I also saw in the chat there. Similarly, at the end of this, and I don't remember if he mentions it right here, but at the end, Avraham will also name the place that where this all happened, and he names it Hashem Yireh. Hashem Yireh. God will see, God will fear, God is the source of fear, to play with it a little bit. But there certainly seems to be a repetition of a theme of Yireh. Having said that, I want to focus on the other word in that phrase of interest, which is rachok. Vayar Atamakom me rachok, which means far or at a distance. And I think that there's a suggestion here, it's implied, but the suggestion, ve'ata haya merachok, is that God appears, here I'm using vayar to mean appear and not just fear, that God appears to Avraham merachok at a distance. Sorry, I again need to, I keep slipping this in. Hamakom, right? Hamakom is a name of God. I saw that somebody referenced it. It's a name of God that might be familiar to you from houses of mourning. Hamakom yenachem etzchem. The place should comfort you. Capital P, the place. The place is a name for God. So one way of understanding Vayar Atamakom merachok, right, is not just that Avraham saw a mountain from afar, but Avraham beheld God at a distance, or a God who felt distant. A God who, one might say, was heretofore unknown to him. And so God appeared hidden. God appeared, again, unknown, unfamiliar. To use the imagery from the Midrash that I mentioned before about the images that are suggested for what did Avraham see? He saw a cloud on top of a mountain. You might also understand or read this in light of that, right? That Avraham beheld kind of cloudiness, blurriness, right? The God that he was so responsive to, Hineni, all of a sudden became fuzzy for him. And the question, though, importantly, and that maybe an aspect of the test was, can he nevertheless, in that space of blurriness, still see? Vayar. So I recognize, right, somebody here is going to tell me, well, you can't have it both ways. It can't be Vayar means to see, and it also means to fear, but it can be. That's the beauty of overdetermined texts. They can be. So it is absolutely the case. Vayar Atamakom merachok can also be read as Avraham saw or beheld God in the distance, or he engaged God with fear. Either way, though, I think that this phrase I find to be rather haunting in and of itself. Vayar Atamakom merachok, and it seems to me that in terms of a kind of spiritual challenge that might resonate with us, might be this challenge of, can one behold God, spirit, eternal, however you feel related to mystery, let's say, can you still see that? Can you still be in touch with that, even when that entity, that feeling, that mystery, that wonder, when it feels far from you? Can you nevertheless still find your way there, or see a glimmer through that cloud? And perhaps this too, let's say, is the test of Avraham, and is maybe the contribution for Avraham as a spiritual paradigm to help orient us toward the clouds, toward the place of not seeing and not knowing and not understanding all of that. Can you nevertheless see it? Can you nevertheless walk toward it? Right? This is a second trial of Lech Lecha, is, can you nevertheless walk toward the places that are shaded or difficult? And to that, if we could scroll down for a moment to see what it is, just actually the last source on this page. So first of all, there's the Rashi for you. Source number 3, go down, please. Source number 3, source number 4, my apologies, is the Rashi, who's quoting the Midrash, right? That Vayar Atamakom merachok ra'a anan kashur al hahar. He saw a cloud lowering or hovering or connected to, or all different ways of understanding kesher, kashur al hahar. But I just wanted to share an association that I have. It's not from the Sfadim per se, but an association that I have in thinking about Vayar Atamakom merachok. And that is that it seems to me that we have multiple verses in the Torah that actually place cloudiness or unclarity or distance, one might say, at the very center of the most holy experiences. So here's one example, and that this comes from the revelation at Sinai. Vaya'amod ha'am nerachok. The people stood at a distance. You can think Vayar Atamakom merachok. Here the people, not Avraham, but the collective, stood back. Umoshe nigash el ha'arafel asher sham ha'elokim. But Moshe, who was not merachok, who was not at a distance, he stepped toward God, who was in a cloud, who was in a fog, arafel. Arafel, like anan, right? These aren't the same exact word. I'm not sure they're the same exact meteorological phenomena. But nevertheless, just the very idea that the grand revelation, right? And the moment itself of connection that is portrayed, at least by our tradition, as being the greatest amount of intimacy that one human being has ever had with God, right? God spoke to Moshe, panim el panim, face to face, right? This was the closest that there ever was, apparently, right? And how is it characterized? Not through transparency, but actually through its opposite. That there's something about intimacy with God that actually necessitates opacity and not transparency. not seeing, right? We famously, not famous, but we often say, right, seeing is believing. And I think I want to argue for you that not seeing is believing, or not seeing is connecting in a certain kind of a way, which might sound really paradoxical. And I think that it is very paradoxical. And yet it seems that there's an essential and spiritual message about the importance of maintaining a modicum of distance, maybe a modicum of individuality, not emerging, which is maybe in contrast with some other particularly Hasidic ideas of dveikut, which even we'll see in other places in the Sfat Emet too, but of really cleaving together. Here we have an important way in which, and maybe this is the balance, right? Avraham, the same guy who wants so badly to cleave, the same guy who is characterized by Ahava, the kirvut, right, by love and intimacy, what he really needs is some distance. Vayar Atamakom merachok, he needs to also learn how to behold God at a distance. So I just want to kind of sum that up a little bit, because I want to note that I'm saying at least two different things, maybe more. And if it's confusing, then I apologize. But I want to suggest that Vayar Atamakom, makom being understood as God, ha-makom, capital letters, Vayar Atamakom nerachok is a kind of spiritual posture that is being asked of Avraham in this test, that is also an invitation to us. And that distance, or that merchak, that distance, I think, is characterized in two ways. One is Vayar Atamakom merachok yir'ah, fear, awe, right? Not relating to God in a modality that isn't necessarily instinctive, and maybe is a little bit more hierarchical or vertical than the Ahava relationship that suggests more reciprocity and equality, frankly. So maintaining that distance, maybe a top-down distance. The suggestion here is that a kind of robust spiritual relationship entails the cultivation both of loving kindness and of gvura, strength, or fear and awe. Chesed and gvura, ahava and yir'ah. And to behold God at a distance is to behold God in a way that might not feel as loving. That's one step. The other one, though, I think is less specific to the midah, or to the attribute of yir'ah per se, but as a suggestion that the kind of the spiritual muscle of beholding God when God doesn't feel near, it's not about fear per se, but that, let me say it differently, that the nature of God's self requires some recognition of distance. And so Moshe meets God in a cloud, and Avraham meets God in a cloud, and the Jewish people will travel in the desert also with a cloud by day, by night it's fire, but a cloud by night. That there's some kind of really interesting relationship between arafel, cloudiness, fog, and in a relationship with God. And this relates, by the way, to those of you who were here last week, the lech lecha idea of keep on walking, because if you actually get to that place, then you know you haven't arrived, so to speak, right? That kind of mind-bending sort of paradox, I think, is also replayed here in a certain kind of a way, right? That if you think you see God not in a cloud, which is to say head on or in the sun, right? Lo yir'ani ha'adam v'chai, the Torah says, right? God, you cannot see God directly, for if you do, you shall die. And you can think about that in a kind of zap, you're getting zapped, boom. or that the selfhood of the individual is compromised. We're one to have or try to have a relationship with God that collapses the distance entirely. Okay, I'm going to pause here for questions or comments, because that was a lot. So let's take the texts off, and we made sure that everyone had the power to unmute themselves, unlike last time. So we're flattening the distance, I hope, a little bit here. We're collapsing a little bit, rather. And speak away. How does this sit with you? What do you think of this read of Vayar Atamakom merachok? Lisa Goldstein, go ahead.
Thank you. I usually like to sit back a little bit, but it's in my head right now. And if I don't let it out, sometimes it will.
Please do.
We'll go somewhere else. The thing that comes to mind very strong for me right now, and what you're teaching us and what I feel like I'm taking from it, is this cloudiness is when we experience something in our lives that seems to be, that just can't happen. There's no God. That just can't happen. A child that dies, you lose someone in your life. And so there's been always this feeling of this loving God. Well, how could that possibly happen? So I see this as, there's this distance, there's this cloudiness, there's this part of God that we may not see and might be in the distance, and not to, I mean, it's easy for me to say, thank goodness. But that's what I'm feeling. That's what I'm getting from this. I don't know if that's
yes
my accuracy. So there is this cloudy side. There is this distance cloud that we may not see and can't see through it in our lives when we experience this.
Yeah.
And feel like, okay, there's no God. I can't believe in this.
Yeah.
Is to be able to maybe understand and know that God is cloudy a lot of times.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I also just, if we have time, I'll point it out in the text itself. But if we don't, I'm just going to say this, that the Sfadamet has a related teaching. It's a different year, but he's also relating to this same idea. And he says explicitly that the year of Avraham here is to the exclusion of Ahava, meaning the verse doesn't say Vaye'ehov Avraham merachok or something like that, right? It doesn't mean that you got to love God in those moments, right? And so you've given us really extreme moments that kind of testify to this point in extreme ways. But the idea that one is not being charged to the degree that we too are being asked to live Avraham's life, if we are, right, that we're not being asked to love God in those moments of distance, but to somehow maintain our ability to see or intuit or feel intimations of. And that's very different from, you got to love God even when God lets you down, essentially, right? You don't have to love God. You can hold on to yirah, but it's okay for yirah and ahava to not always coexist. Okay, Arnold Black, go ahead.
First time I ever thought about this, but it reminds me a lot of the book of Job, where you can't really understand God, why he's doing this. And then at least in Job, when you ask him, or when he asks him, God pretty much says, who are you to ask? And so it's like you've got to accept this.
Yep.
Accept the good with the bad, accept the fear with the love.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, Job is a little bit more, let's say, affirming, or explicitly so, of this God who does cruel things. Right? He says, like, God gave and God took, and God's name should be blessed. And at this moment, at least, we don't have that kind of, frankly, more loving statement coming from Avraham. He's just seeing, and he's just continuing to walk and abide and submit to this to this God who otherwise is unknown to him. But yes, I think you're absolutely right that both his story and Job's story in different ways point us to the reality of a God who hides, an El Mistater, a God who hides, and sometimes does some pretty unpalatable things. Okay, Rabbi Lisa Hochberg, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I really love this teaching that at times, we feel love for God and at times we feel distance from God. And it almost feels like this story is about God reestablishing boundaries, that there was like too much love, too much. See, if we think about chapter 21 and, God is the marriage counselor in there with Hagar and Sarah. So I do get that piece. I think I have a question about the word Vayar Atamakom merachok. This wonderful notion of Abraham having to learn to relate to God out of fear and not just out of love, and seeing God at a distance, that place of fear. But this teaching then from the Sifat Emet that like at the top of the mountain, the distance, the cloud, that's the place where everything else sort of is not visible, but God dwells in the clouds. So it seems like the cloud is a place of intimacy and closeness with God, as opposed to, I'm hearing two kinds of imagery happening with the cloud. And so I'm just trying to work my way through.
Okay, let me see if I'm
ambiguous.
No, but that's the point. So I think that's exactly it, right? That let's come back. We'll come to the Moses image for a moment, right? Moshe nigash el ha'arafel. It's a paradox. That's precisely what we're seeing, right? Moshe nigash, right, is about approach. It's a suggestion of intimacy, and it's actually in contrast to the people who are, vayamod ha'am merachok, right? The people are standing back, and Moshe's approaching. So you might think, if you were to stay with these images, and he went into a blazing, sunny, I don't know, whatever, right? Or he just saw God. And so I think that's precisely what is happening here. Is the paradox is that even, or specifically in those moments of greatest intimacy, what you discover, I think maybe we can think about it in interpersonal terms, right? That like sometimes, if we're lucky, right, that in moments of greatest intimacy, what we might find in our partners is the mystery that drew us to begin with, And it's not that everything is known; it's that it's not everything is known, and that itself is the sort of the continued energy that might draw people together. And so I see that happening. Moshe's in the Arafel. He is like cleaving to God in his not seeing God, in his not knowing God. That actually is the stickiness in a way, right? There are a lot of other images. Another thing to think about is in the temple, the Kruvim, right? The Kruvim, where there's like cherubs, those angel people. We don't really know what they are, right? But we're also told that like they face each other and God like speaks through them, and that God speaks specifically, right? But they're not actually totally together, but it's actually right through the gaps. Like God speaks through the gaps. So I just kind of playing with a bunch of different images, but I hope that that's in a certain way a response to you, and also a thank you to you, because you're pointing out what is an essential paradox here that actually is really very much the point. So I hope that that's okay. Julie Cole, go ahead.
I just wanted to try to tie a few things together, which was the fact that I didn't realize that, but the fact that in mourning, that's when you use the word hamakom and I just really feel like I kind of got something this time that we all struggle with this idea of how can God command Abraham to sacrifice his son? But the reality of life is that, the fragility of life, and that at any moment, it's almost like being commanded by, the enemy with the gun in front of you. Like, yeah, if you don't kill your son, we're going to kill him. So, God could do anything at any time anyway. And so maybe, so I just feel like there's this real sense of all of this about the love and awe of dealing with the the impermeability, impermanence, impermanence. And I think it's helpful what you said about that you don't have both the love and the yira at the same moment, that you're allowed to sort of feel a lot of fear or anger in one period and a lot of love in another, that you're not really, it's okay that you're not going to feel love at that moment, that you're really overwhelmed with grief.
Yeah, thank you. If I can just build on that for a moment too, I'll say that I appreciate you bringing us back to the way that this particular name of God is used kind of liturgically or ritually in lots of Jewish communities. Like I never really thought about it before as drawing us to the Akedah story, but it's specifically right in moments of mourning that one might feel related or connected to this aspect of Avraham, who was challenged to see God at a distance, right? And that may be some of what we wish, hamakom yinachem etzchem, we might wish for a person in mourning, is not to be full of ahava per se, though I hope they are for those who they have lost, God forbid, but hamakom yinachem, that you should find some comfort in the mystery, that you should find some comfort, right? Or maybe find some comfort in situating yourself in a story that has relationships with God that change, that evolve, that accent different things at different times. And insofar as you might be in a cloud in this moment, let this be part of your story, or let this be a story that you might relate to, or a God you relate to. So yeah, really thanks for that. Anyone else? Kathy? Or was that a hand or an applause?
It was supposed to be a hand.
Oh, it was supposed to be. Okay, great. Yes, please.
No, I just thank you very much. Very interesting and thought-provoking. I was just thinking about Hineni, and which you mentioned, and that in the last portion, Abraham bowed down at the entrance to his tent, and took that kind of attitude of humility. And here, the call, I guess, to some degree, is that can we still say Hineni when we feel the distance with God or with each other?
Yeah, totally. Right. I think it's fantastic to keep in mind, right, that this same Avraham, who's Vayar Atamakom merachok, is the same guy who's also willing to say Hineni. And how do you move between those modes? Or maybe they're the same, but right, to recognize that, those two impulses are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but are really hard. So thank you. Janet, go ahead.
Could you speak a little to the comment from, I guess it's Anne Rickover? I liked it when she says we need to balance Gevurah with Hesed. And if you could speak to that, it's almost like Moses had only love and almost too much. It wasn't, you talked earlier about he needed to find balance.
Yeah. So I don't see that specific comment, but that's absolutely,
okay.
That's okay. But I think, the point very much stands and is pretty, I'd say kind of almost, but not quite explicit in the text from the Sfat himself, that yes, Avraham was characterized or understood to be full on love prior to this moment, totally consumed. And that, right, ironically, the lesson that he needed from God, it seemed, was, I don't know, back off a little bit, or let's have a little bit of space. And yes, that is the balance between chesed and gevura, ahava and yirah, right? And I come back to the Moses image. right? The very idea that revelation, collective revelation, which is the story of Sinai, the collective revelation takes place at a distance. It's part and parcel of, let me say it differently, the primary rules that constructed or informed the space, makom, of revelation at Har Sinai was boundaries. Boundaries. The main thing that the people are told are don't touch. They're also told not to touch each other, which is also interesting. Okay, but they're told not to touch the mountain. Don't approach it. And similarly, in the holy space of the Mishkan, or the tabernacle, and ultimately the temple, right? There's also an importance in boundary, in not approaching, right? And so there's this like distance dance of like, come, right? Also, sorry, I'm just associating, maybe this is annoying to some of you, I apologize, but Moshe too, right, is God when at his personal revelation, not at Sinai, but his personal revelation at the burning bush, God also says, Al tikrav, like don't come too close, right? I've got this fire going and you're supposed to come look at it, but wait, right? Just hold your horses, right? Like stay back. And so there's a thread of repetition that I think just requires us to make sense of somehow, that really runs through so many of these stories that are supposed to be pinnacle stories of connection that are characterized by some degree of boundary, some degree of distance. And I think it's a message about spiritual relationships, and it's a message about human relationships, and the role of boundaries in intimacy, I think, is something that is very much privileged in these texts and in these stories. Okay, I said so much. Sorry. Ilana, go ahead. Ilana Axel.
Hi, thank you. So my mind is going in so many different directions right now, which is really, really enriching. Thank you. As you spoke, I'm thinking about the sacrificial system, and what I think of as sort of the between the Israelites trying to get close to God, and what's between them is the smoke on the altar. So that
nice.
The smokiness and the cloudiness. And I've always thought of that as, the sacrificial system is the interface that we can't actually get on the other side of, but we imagine God is on the other side of, and God sees us on the other side. And then my mind went to, in our prayer, the Gvurot prayer, we say, Melech Memitu Mechaye, which is, the God of life and of death. So I think often in religion, we think of we think, God of goodness, and God is great, and God is love, and God is compassionate, and all of that is true. And I think we're seeing that in the story. However, in Deuteronomy, we have the text, when you come into you have everything that you ever wanted. You would think we would say we're going to be so in love with God, but actually it says you will forget God. That's when you forget God, and that's why we say the blessings, Right. So that takes me to Sodom, back to the Michaseh, which I think is fascinating to me. And I'm asking the question because I'm not sure. I'm just trying to think it in my mind. But Sodom might be the first time we see in Torah that God is sharing with Abraham God's destructive powers on a mass level. I'm not sure, but unlike this.
I mean, there's the flood, but that's not Abraham. That's Noah.
Exactly. So let's say Abraham known of the flood, but now God is sharing this information. He says, God says, nice. I will no longer should I hide this. So now we're allowing Abraham closer, but not into the love part, but into the part of destruction. And will Abraham still be able to love God and have this relationship when Abraham now is fully aware of the destructive powers of God, fully aware of God's, somebody wrote it earlier in the chat, the ability to take life away suddenly, which is about to happen. So all of this together, I think, is just beautiful and fascinating. Thank you.
It is really beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. I love particularly the image of the smoke, just because I'm going with that. And I also, this isn't, I'm expanding the analogy perhaps a little bit too far, but I think also something that I think about when we imagine this holy place, right? The Holy of Holies. It's so dirty. It's so smelly. It's so like full of ashes, right? And part of what the Kohen does day after day is Trumat Hadeshin, is like removing the ashes. He's the janitor. He's the janitor of the holy space. And like, that's a holy job, but just a recognition that, our notions of holiness or our notions of sanctity come with a lot of dirt, a lot of mess, and a lot of smoke and and clouds. So thank you. I really appreciate all of that so much. Okay, Martha, go ahead.
I'm preoccupied with Isaac.
Mm-hmm.
Poor
guy.
What? And how what a murderous experience to not be able to trust your father, and that Abraham like fights for Sodom but doesn't speak up for his son.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel it sets like a terrible precedent, like that God is more important than the love for your child. I just can't work with that. I just can't let that one go. And that every day in the morning prayers, it's a refer to this as if this is some wonderful thing that he did. And to me, it's to me, he failed the test completely.
Okay. So this can take us to a totally different sphere, but it's fascinating. And it's so right? Okay, we'll leave aside all the dirt and stuff and talk about the kind of the sullied relationship now between Avraham and Yitzchak. And I think you're absolutely right. I lost you on my screen, but I'm going to talk to you anyway. That something that's just noteworthy about this story, coming away from this Emet for the moment, but back to the narrative itself, is that on some level, Avraham really did sacrifice Isaac, in that the relationship was not repaired after this. They don't have a relationship after this. They don't they don't like walk hand in hand, side by side ever again. It's not clear that he has a relationship with his son. Based on next week's parsha of Chaye Sarah, it's not clear that he has a relationship with his wife, right? So like, there's a lot. You're absolutely right, Martha, that there's something very, very disturbing at the core of this story, in the ways that, Avraham twice over, I'm going to amplify this even more, twice over, Avraham is asked to cut human ties in order, it seems, to pursue religious ties, right? Like leave behind your dad, right? Your father's home. So leave behind your past. In this week's portion is, and now cut off your future too, right? So sacrifice your father, sacrifice your son, maybe sacrifice your wife. Like, there's so much that's really, really, really problematic. So did he pass or fail? Well, I don't know, right? I mean, he certainly sacrificed. We'll say that. Is that something that we ought to be admiring of? I'd like to think not, but it's something that we do need to reckon with. And I can start associating here too, but Moses also is not known for his family relations. Jacob, not so known for his family relations. Like, we have a lot of flawed characters who are on the one hand meant or put forward as spiritual giants, and also really don't always get right the balance. Forget Ahava and Yira, but between like love of God and love of human beings. And that's a problem. And that's, I suppose, just one of the many difficulties that we inherit when we inherit these Torah stories. Okay, one last question or comment, Rabbi Rebecca. Go ahead.
So it was just on this last point that you were making about the impact in the life of this family, right? God never speaks to Abraham again in the Torah after this event. Sarah doesn't speak in the Torah after Genesis 21:10 when she lobbies to kick Hagar and Ishmael out of the camp. Isaac doesn't speak to Abraham again in the Torah, nor does Abraham speak to Isaac again. And actually, Isaac doesn't have dialogue again in the Torah until Genesis chapter 26, verse 7 in Gerar. And there in verse 9, he's actually deceiving Avimelech because he feared for his life.
Oh, fear. There's fear.
And I'll go check if it's the same verb.
Probably. Yeah. How awful is that? Right. So coming back to Martha's question of did he pass or did he fail? Well, I don't know. You tell me, right? If God doesn't talk to you anymore and your family doesn't talk to you anymore, or you don't talk to your family, I don't know. Is that a failure or is that a win? I'm guessing that on a human level, it is not a win. And I'd like to believe that there's a relationship between the godly one and the human one, and that success in one would yield success in another, but not always so. Having said that, I don't want to end on totally a down note of that kind, but actually come back to something that I said toward the beginning of what actually animates this kind of commentary at all. And I think that part of what animates a read of this kind is, I said before, to salvage God in the picture, but maybe also to salvage Avraham as well. And so it doesn't square all the circles or whatever, right? It doesn't tie up all loose ends at all. But as a kind of spiritual moment in time, the lesson of Vayar Atamakom merachok, I hope, can still stand as some kind of emblem of at least the complexities of the religious stance toward hamakom merachok, towards a God who is at a distance, maybe only more so on account of stories like this one. So thank you, everybody. I hope